business or are you running a business? Valuation is the ultimate KPI.
Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast, brought to you by Truelytics, the one and only comprehensive advisor transition management platform. This week on the show, the Elevate CPA Group gents are back with me, and we're going to be talking about why some RIA firm purchases fail while others flourish. And this is a big, consequential topic, not only because it sounds like one, but it really is one. Nearly 30% of today's financial advisors are expected to exit the business in the next decade. We talk about that coming wave of transition a lot on this show. And frankly, that's kind of like the origin thesis for Truelytics. And what that means is those advisors are going to exit the business by selling their business, either through planned succession or traditional M&A. And what it also means is on the other side of that equation, there's a buyer. Either that buyer is an individual advisor or that buyer is, a firm acquiring another firm. And anytime you have that type of transaction, there's a lot of moving parts. A lot can go wrong. And what we wanted to do is have Brian, Joe, and Rick back on the show to talk about some of the things that buyers and sellers can do pre and post acquisition to make sure the deal is a success for everybody involved, including the clients and the staffs of the firm. Everybody will be happy, okay? You are going to love this episode. Before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, the YouTubes if you want to see what the gents look like and all our fun facial expressions that we make throughout the episode. And as always, if you have questions or suggestions for guests or topics for the show, please send those in, podcast@truelytics.com, or you can reach out to us, swing by truelytics.com, use that contact form, or you can just reach out on the socials. I'm at Mike Langford everywhere. You can also find Truelytics active on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and again, YouTube, okay? Let's get to the conversation with Brian Nuttall, Joe DeMarco, and Rick Wilkens of the famous spreadsheet Wilkenses. Let's do it. Joe DeMarco, Brian Nuttall, and Rick Wilkens of the most magnificent spreadsheet creation known to man. Welcome back to the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. It's so great to have Team Elevate CPA Group with us again. How you guys doing?
Good. Doing well.
Doing well.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thanks.
It's fantastic to see you guys. And by the way, thank you for being flexible, for bouncing around on the technology here. We tried one solution, now we're on another solution. And I always tell everybody, anyone who's doing a podcast or these video recording things, have a couple of backup solutions. Have some things in your pocket. They're not that expensive. So be ready in the event that one of them decides to fail you or act a little wonky. That's probably what you tell your clients too. Have a backup plan.
Exactly.
So your team reached out with an idea to get you guys back on the show that I thought was so fantastic, and I couldn't wait to do it. And then, of course, I did have to wait because this thing called tax season, which seems to get guys in your profession busy every year for some reason, popped up in the way. But I'm really, really excited about it. So the suggestion topic was success versus failure. Why some RIA firms, the purchases of some RIA firms fail while others flourish. And I'm like, that's an awesome idea because I guarantee you there's been lots of failures, right? Or what less than ideal outcomes, right? And then others that just turn out way better than we might have imagined. So, Joe, why don't we start with you? When you think about this, how do you? Well, actually, maybe do you have any examples of a financial advisory firm, a purchase that's kind of gone south that you can think of without naming names, of course?
Yeah, I don't have one that's gone south in particular. I will say I have one that I'm working with now that's gone in the opposite direction. So I think, like, I guess you could use the opposite approach of this example, but the advisory firm was started by one individual. He went through multiple acquisitions to grow the firm and grew it organically as well. And what inevitably happened was, as he was growing, he was bringing on advisor reps to work with him, right? So it got to a point recently where these advisor reps wanted to buy into the business. and and I'm sure with any business, for it to grow and do well or to backfire, you're going to, in a service industry, you're going to hit that point. You'll hit that tipping point where someone's going to want to buy it, more than likely, right? So what we worked with together was what's the best structure to have these people buy in, and that gets into some other points during this podcast. But valuation came into play, structure of how these people would buy in and get paid, who would manage the firm. So all of that proactive advice and guidance, and he had legal counsel as well, was done on the front end. If that's not done, it won't go well. And I mean, and we even see it in our industry, in the public accounting industry. It's very similar. So that's an example. It's not, I mean, how it went wrong, but how it went right. But it could have gone very wrong if I think a lot of that wasn't done in advance.
That's a great kind of the way to say it. Maybe I tipped off the question the wrong way, and maybe I should have asked it. And maybe Rick, you can tee off on this one. Is how can it go wrong?
Yeah, I think where it goes wrong is or can go wrong. I mean, there's various ways it can. And Joe kind of hit it on the head. It's not just with the RIA world, but it's any organization that you're looking to buy or where you might have a failure with or a lack of success. It's on the front end if you don't do your due diligence. Right? If you're looking at it just to acquire, if you're the buyer, right? Maybe, if you're acquiring 10 and you're happy with getting 8, maybe that's your model. But it really is more on the front end of doing the due diligence, making sure things are a cultural fit and not necessarily always just a financial fit. We've seen that with other professional service organizations as well, where you're rushing in there because you think this is a great model and I'm going to grow this thing. I'm going to be the next, Edward Jones, whoever, right? You're going to grow this thing just by acquisition. And what ends up happening is sometimes you get a bad one, and sometimes that poisons what you already have, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really important to get in there early, let the players know what's going on, make sure that the person maybe you're buying it from has that exit strategy as well. So they're not kind of hanging on and disrupting the normal course of business by the old, 5-6 years ago, I was doing it this way and I had success. Well, we don't do that anymore. We do it this way, and all the people are going to be doing it this way, right? So it really is more on the front end of the work to prevent something. It doesn't always work that way, but 9 times out of 10, if you do your homework and have those good, honest discussions ahead of time, it'll work out.
Brian, have you ever had that example, Brian, where you're sitting there with an advisor who's like talking about acquiring another business, and you bring up that thing like, hey, make sure you think of this, and they get that, oh, I didn't think of that?
Yeah, I have. I actually, unfortunately, have a scenario where an advisory firm went and bought a book of business and kind of told me after the fact. And yeah, it just, from an outsider's viewpoint to what Rick was saying, you could see it wasn't necessarily a fit for them. It wasn't quite the same wealth range of clients. The clients weren't as sophisticated, probably weren't looking for the same level of service. And, I think they did okay with it, but it wasn't the home run they wanted. And I think an interesting, for me, part of it is some of the, it grew their valuation as a firm, right? Because they brought more AUM, but it didn't necessarily grow their bottom line as it should have, or in proportion. And I think that can cause problems too, because now, yes, you keep growing this firm and you keep adding value, but you're not adding cash flow at the same point. And can those founders ever get bought out when you're not increasing that cash flow to the same extent? So I always worry a little bit when it is that value gain, not as much with the cash, the cash generation part side of it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in our last conversation, one of the things that delighted me is I guess the best way of saying it in listening to you guys talk about what you do for your RIA clients is that you help them grow the business in many ways, not just top line growth, right? Not just AUM growth, that you're looking for efficiencies. You're trying to help them make the business a better performing business. And to your point, Brian, just acquiring another firm that brings in a whole bunch of AUM and therefore increases the revenue and therefore increases the valuation, that doesn't necessarily mean the business is actually performing any better if I'm not, putting more profit in my pocket afterwards. But we're doing a lot of work. It's not the best, It's like, it's good, but it could be better, right? You do want to find some efficiencies in there. There should be some scaling stuff that happens as a result, I would imagine. How do you have those conversations with the client? How do you recommend an advisor start thinking about that before they enter in to the agreement to buy?
Well, one of the things we'll do is we'll look at obviously the firm they're buying and take a look at their at the structure, at, let's say, pick a metric, seller discretionary income or whatever it might be, right? Just to see what are the owners, or what can the owners actually take, what have they taken out, right, cash wise, and what can they take out, right? It's going back and looking at certain things, expenses, whatever it might be. And then applying the factor, to that, and try to develop, some synergies with your existing. Try to look at, if your multiple is, 6 times. I mean, you find, 15 grand. I mean, it's another 90 grand to the, to the value, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily hitting the top line at all, right? Just adding to the top line, as Brian said, and nothing to the bottom doesn't really. It reminds me of an old Saturday Night Live skit where they went into the change store and they gave $1 and got 4 quarters, and the guy said, "Well, how do you make money?" He goes, "Well, we make it up in volume." So it's not. It's the same thing. The volume isn't really the driver. It's what do you bring into the bottom, right? What do you bring into the bottom line? So I think that's the comparison. Looking at something other than the top line is important, right? And the makeup and what the types of clients you have, the age group, types of accounts, whatever it might be. But that bottom line really is the driver.
I think a couple other things too, like to add to that, would be a lot of times when you get into this, to Rick and Brian's points, you're looking at it from obviously a revenue perspective, but a profitability perspective. A lot of times people don't look at it from like the end after tax perspective, though, because you're paying the person you're buying out over time, right? Mm-hmm. And that's coming off typically operating cash flow or income, which is taxable. So a lot of times, when you're looking at this and you're trying to scale this out in terms of a payoff, folks sometimes don't look at that after tax. Now you do get, when you structure these on the front end, that's what we like to help clients with. And when you ask me that question, what could go wrong? We typically try to not, we don't like to work with clients when these types of things go wrong. We try to prevent that as much as possible. But we look at those types of situations because when you're buying in, you do get a goodwill deduction for that acquisition, right? So you're getting some tax benefit. But a lot of times you're not looking at, well, okay, I have to pay this person off over 5 or 6 years. That eats into a lot of the profitability, if not all of it. And you're doing a lot of work and you're basically building equity, you hope, with that purchase, but it's a lot of time being spent. And a lot of times you forget about that factor. And it's like, well, could you be spending your time building the business organically and not having to pay someone off in time? Because we all know those minutes in the day just get drained quickly. So I think that's important. And Brian and I were talking before the call here, before the podcast, on culture, right, Brian? Like how important that is. I don't know if you want to talk to that point, but I think it's really critical.
Yeah, I think, there's so many parts of success in a advisory firm, right? I mean, you have to have that culture good internally, culture between the partners, culture with the clients, and all those parts have to come together. And that's really, it is hard. I think that's one of the hard things. And we were talking quite a bit about how do you avoid some of the some of the landmines that are out there, that if you just have those conversations on the front end, and this isn't as much in purchases, maybe it's more with two or more advisors coming together, either joining their businesses or going out on their own, but really having those conversations about how are we going to treat this entity? Are we eat what you kill, kind of a conglomerate of multiple advisors that share a name in a space, but that's about it? Or are we really trying to build a business here? And it's not an eat what you kill. It's all for one for all in some way, shape, or form. And those are, when we see several years down the road after advisors or to Rick's point, any service provider that blow up, compensation is almost always the issue.
Right.
And it's because some of these things weren't ever discussed on the front end or really thought about from when the money wasn't sitting there in front of us. It becomes a lot harder when that money's there and people are trying to grab it.
You brought up a couple of really interesting issues there. I mean, number one, like, think about the business, right? The collective. Is it a group of individuals doing individual stuff with, oh yeah, we're going to share some overhead, right? I mean, that's one way of doing it. So we all have our own book of business. You do yours, I do mine. We'll share an admin and we'll share a building, but go on your own way. Or like you said, is this a business that functions that in the event that, one of us, has to take some time off, the business still functions, but the clients will come in and see who's available? Or a scenario where the other one that it's interesting to me is talents, right? So we all have different talents, right? So I'm really good at talking. That's my thing. Well, some people are great at sales. Some people are great. They're great rainmakers, right? I'm great at surfing indoors here. I might say. But you know what I mean? Like so everybody's got different talents, different strengths, and then you get together and you realize, hey, Joe, man, you were just great at bringing on the new clients and onboarding clients and so forth. Brian is the really good operational dude, making us more efficient, and Rick's amazing at spreadsheets, as we've covered many times. He's just phenomenal. How do you guys coach? I mean, you actually had to walk through this process together. You formed Elevate CPA from other. How do you advise or walk advisors through this cultural fit thing? Because you're right, it is so important. And then how do you walk them through that compensation conversation?
Yeah, compensation's the tough one, right?
Yeah.
I think you do need an advisor that's willing to say the hard things, and willing to put people on the spot a little bit. I think it's some of the what if questions that need to be asked. What if we got a $30 million client here? How would we split that? What if it's my golfing buddy, father or something? Whatever it is, you have to throw out those scenarios, and I think the more you can do that, the more it forces people to kind of speak their mind and see, are you really on that fit? I think the harder one, and maybe Rick or Joe have some other insight on this one too, is how do you get people doing their highest and best views and valuing all these things? I think it's really hard in service type industries, and investment advisors are no different. Everybody thinks they have to be a producer. It's all about production, client relations, all those things. But what about that person who's charting the way for the firm and doing those things that are building that structure to let us grow? Are those as valuable? And that's really is kind of a cultural decision you have to make.
Right, and you have to be on the same wavelength with that, right? So if I think I'm more on the sales, marketing, bringing in business side, and I haven't brought anything in 5 or 6 years, someone's got to be able to tell me you're not that guy, right? You're not, and they hopefully it doesn't take 5 or 6 years for someone to say that, but sometimes it does, because to Brian's point, you got to have those difficult difficult discussions, sometimes. So I think people need to sit down and lay out what they believe their strengths are and what they want to do. And you can't have everybody doing the same thing and someone not doing one thing. But everybody has to be on the same page with that and honest with, that's not really you might think it's your strength, but it's not.
Yeah.
It really is something else. So.
And I think lastly, to both those points, it Mike, when you ask, how do we go about it? And I think that's what makes Elevate unique, because what we do is when we start working with a client, we are working with a client consistently. Like, it's not, you can't guide someone if you don't know all the moving parts of their personalities. It's impossible. Like, we can't bring a client on a new RIA and say, we're going to speak with you at the end of the year for tax planning and we'll give you your tax returns. That's not going to provide them any value at all with getting advice from a third party that have seen a lot of arrangements and seen a lot of businesses and seen a lot of RIAs, to give them value to say, hey, maybe you should look out for this, or hey, you're thinking about acquiring this firm, these are things you should look into. So our approach has always been more of that proactive approach, where once we work with a client, hence like our CFO arrangement, but we have our tax background as well to provide, it's every month we're touching base, because usually questions lead into more questions. That always, it's inevitable. So if something comes up, it's guaranteed going to lead into something else that's going to lead into something else. And then before you know it, you start to really build that relationship with someone where A, trust is built, which I think is key, because they're going to reach out to you. And B, you have this intimate understanding of how they function and how they run their business, so you could give them more advice. So I think bringing in what Rick and Brian said with culture and being proactive and all that, it really takes both sides, like, us and them, in working together on a consistent basis to guide them to see and, tell them, hey, here's our opinion. They could take it or not, but at least they're getting more advice to guide them to grow their business. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies a bit.
Yeah, no, it does. It helps a lot.
Yeah.
Right?
I would just add one little thing. I think as he was talking, as Joe was talking, what popped in my head was, listen to your advisors. It doesn't mean you have to follow all their advice, but you need to have an open mind and listen. I mean, we've been involved in, probably between us, thousands upon thousands of businesses. And you've seen all sorts of things go right and wrong. And so listen to that, and if you say, well, what are you going to do with X? And they go, oh, that's not going to happen to us.
Right.
Well, it very well may, because we've seen it happen. And
you're on the path.
Having that open mind,
Right,
and really listening and having those hard conversations pays off. I mean, it really does pay off.
Well, it's kind of like, getting married, right? You have to have some of those hard conversations before you get married. And when we were, my wife and I were young and engaged, we wanted to get married to the church, and they made us come to this like marriage readiness class. Like, you couldn't get married at that church. They made you sit through a whole day of like, hey, ask you the questions, like what, money questions. What are your thoughts about having a family? How many kids do you want? What type of house do you want to live in? Like, what are your aspirations for your type of life? And those are good questions to have for any couple that you may not have, thought about it before. Like, oh, you're a city guy, I'm a country girl. Like, are we going to be able to do this? A suburb's going to be an adequate compromise. You don't want any kids? Like, I want a dozen, whatever, that type of stuff. So it's a really, but having those conversations, is really smart. One of the things that brought us together was, and I believe it was you, Brian, you talked about how, on the last podcast we did together, how you discovered Truelytics through a friend of yours mentioning, go listen to this podcast. And sure enough, and it unfortunately made Rick's spreadsheet obsolete. Sorry, Rick, buddy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm working on revision number 3, so we'll get there.
But
Google actually followed up with Rick. We have an offer on the table right now
they-
from Google,
nice,
right, Rick? They
Rick.
want to
Right,
buy it,
yeah.
implement it as part of their
Yeah.
system.
Oh.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
what
Melinda Gates just lost her big investor, so now she's coming to me to look for something.
this is
going
true.
on
This is true,
for the
right? Yeah, exactly.
spreadsheet,
You're
yeah.
about to be the
Yeah.
Yeah.
be the Wilkens Foundation sometime before you know it. It's gonna be great.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about was like how you're using the tool to help with clients. I wonder if you use Truelytics in any interesting ways to kind of create an objective picture as two companies or two businesses are thinking about merging or one acquiring another outright. Do you kind of like line it up and go, okay, strengths, weaknesses here? Like how are you using the tool? I mean, this is not a Truelytics, what's that Truelytics podcast, but it's not a commercial necessarily, but I'm curious, like how are you using the tool to kind of maybe, because some of the stuff we talked about so far, there's a little bit of some might call it squishiness, but it's the softer side things. Like, how are you going to feel about this? And I am going to feel about this. But like, as you said, like, let's get some objectivity here. Like, this is what this says. Like, right?
I think it is. It's such a great tool to put those objective numbers to things. It's not only valuation, which I think if you're buying, you should be independently looking at a valuation, and not just taking what, oftentimes the business broker is bringing you on the value. But I think it's all those other things, the number of relationships, the generations in the relationships, the ages, a lot of those KPIs really can make a big difference. And I think just like we talked about before, that we can help a current RIA get those things stronger. I think on the merger and the sales, you can really look at where are those opportunities. Where are those opportunities to get stronger, or is this really, if I'm looking at two potential purchases, I'm guessing they're not apples to apples, even if they're the same amount of assets under management.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's switch gears a little bit about kind of like the post acquisition, if you want to call it, or post merger world, where we have a scenario where you didn't just have two advisors coming together, but you had teams coming together, right? So there's clerical staff, if you will, right, office staff. There are junior advisors and more senior advisors on now. The war for talent is a real deal, right? And so anytime that you have that type of movement, they see the ownership change, and there's likely and logically, I think, everybody starts going, do I like this? Maybe I should explore a change of scenery here. I mean, just changed ownership. Maybe I can take, my business, my book of business and go someplace else or whatever. And sometimes it's like, maybe they're like, what, I loved working for Joe, but now this guy Rick's here.
Right.
It happens, right? It does. We've all been there, right? We've worked at a company and suddenly there's a new boss or a new whatever VP on the floor. You're like, guy's kind of a jerk, or guy's just like, I don't mesh with him or whatever. His style is messing with me. So what do you work on with clients, or what do you advise clients to do to make sure that like their top talent, specifically the most valuable talent, that stays after this merger?
Some of that actually goes back to the cultural piece, where before the deal is done, right? Again, it goes all to that, is that some of those folks, I think you need to, on your top talent, you need to have that, you as an owner, need to have that conversation with them. If you get to a point where you're comfortable with doing a deal, to talk to your top talent, to communicate to them, to let them know. And maybe there's something that they can, fire off some questions or talk to some folks maybe on the similar level as them at the other place, kind of on the QT, and just to go through the process, just to see if it is a fit, because at least you could kind of, not that you as an owner, you still might make the deal, right, regardless of what someone is saying, but at least you give them that opportunity, to do that. We had that similarly a number of years ago with a firm that I worked with, and we were going to be acquired, and that was they called it a merger, but it was actually an acquisition, right? So but that was that was part of the deal. It was like the manager level, younger partner level, really kind of went in there and had the opportunity to speak to some folks to see if it was going to be a fit. Because why would you continue on if you don't think it is, right? So I think it's just more on the front end to help get through some of that.
Makes sense.
I also think, Mike, I mean, it's critical. We're seeing, because you're right. This war for good talent is out there. And I was talking to Brian for the podcast about another issue, but it's not unless they're locked down with a non-compete. Like you buy a firm, there's a book, they bring some people over, and I'm assuming there's going to be some type of non-competes in place, or there should be. But it's not as difficult as it once was to set up an independent RIA. Like if you have the assets, that barrier to entry is dropped dramatically just due to technology. I mean, regulatory compliance has gotten easier. The cost to utilize different softwares is becoming a lot cheaper. So you have to be cognizant that when you acquire a book of business from someone and they retire, but they have some younger advisor reps coming on board, I think it's critical that that plan for what you expect from them and what they expect from you over time, with some type of goal setting. Like, is there going to be incentives in place? Are they going to be able to buy into the business over a period of time? What value? Profit incentives, are they bonused out based on how much they produce? So I think, it does become critical with an acquisition for it to be successful, unless the buyer has complete capacity to absorb all that new work, which typically is not the case unless you're starting out. But typically, a seller is not going to work with a buyer that's just deciding, okay, you know what, I'm going to start an RIA firm and I'm buying your book of business. I mean, they're going to want some establishment at that buyer's firm. So typically that RIA buyer is going to not have the capacity, the hours to take on all that work. And it becomes so critical, with that talent that you're bringing on to provide them some type of incentive plans, whether equity-based, profit-based, what have you, so they have a goal in mind. Because we know if that's not in place, more than likely they're going to question, why am I here? And that's what you don't want to happen.
I wonder if you recommended, that there should be a spend on or an investment, let's call it investment, I guess, but on, post-acquisition merger fit stuff. Like I can't articulate it the right way, but if I were buying a house as an example, or I'm buying a business, what like a retail business of some sort, I'm going to want to put some new paint on the walls. Probably I'm going to want to probably change like the things that haven't been done in a while, right? I mean, change the carpeting, whatever it is. But there's going to be some things you want to do. So to make sure it does feel new, or you're walking into it and it's stable. In the case of talent, if I'm acquiring another business, we're merging two companies, and like you said, merging two cultures, it may be worth spending a few tens of thousands of dollars to do some offsite workshop type stuff, to do some leadership training maybe, or to like you said, have these discussions about comp plans, making sure that you don't find out, hey, here we're joining teams, and oh, by the way, the comp plans are different for the legacy people and the new folks. Like, cause that can get ugly real quick when you start finding like, oh, well, you're with Joe's old company. Yeah. You guys get paid well. Brian pays us like crap compared to you guys,
Right. And that gets around quickly. Yeah. People talk quickly. They find that out. Yeah. Within days. Yeah. So-and-so is making X, and no doubt about it.
I think to your point, there's a certain number of people who are just going to be frustrated with change.
Sure.
We have to change phone systems, if we even have phone systems.
Right.
Or whatever it is, computer systems, and that's going to put them over the edge.
Yeah, or software, something that is
Yeah, and there's just a certain
Mhm.
amount of people in an organization that doesn't, it has nothing to do with numbers, it has nothing to do with their day to day, it's just change.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Change is going to blow them up. And so I think identifying who are those key people? Are those key people we can work with, people who are going to flow with this change and see for the better here, and focus on, and people who will focus on the material items, how we're doing our client interactions, our investment strategy, our
Yeah.
sales process. Those are material items, not, our carpet's blue instead of gray now, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pissed. So,
Well, look, gray, blue can really get on your nerves after a while. Just say.
it's depressing.
You ever see that football team? Like, there's a college football field that has
Oh,
like a
yeah.
blue field.
Yeah, I think it's Oregon, or is it Oregon? Or oh,
I
is it
thought it was
Boise?
Boise State.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is
think-
Boise. It drives me nuts every time I see it on the TV. It makes me want to throw up. I'm
Yeah.
like, I can't imagine
Yeah.
playing on that thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, don't put blue AstroTurf in your conference room. Just saying, it'll annoy people post merger. We've only got about 10 minutes or so left with each other on this. Some of these topics here, but I'm fascinated by this. One of the notes that your team sent over, is kind of knowing your numbers and understanding quality of earnings to the business valuation. Like, so what are the quality of the earnings as you're thinking about this? Because I would imagine there's difference. So in your mind, when you're advising advisors who are getting ready to enter an M&A or just outright acquisition, what should they be looking at from a quality perspective?
Well, I think with the quality of earnings, and we also do those types of reports for acquisitions and so forth. But what you're looking at, right? You're kind of starting at what the number is you're given, like for a P&L number, right? Here's the net income is this. Well, let's go into the pieces that make that up on the expense side, on the revenue side, and let's somewhat normalize it and say, okay, is it, let's say, for instance, you're renting 2,000 square feet of space, right? And the fair market rent in that wherever you are is $15 a foot, but you're paying $30 a foot. It's because the owner owns the building and he's getting rent that way, right? So let's normalize that, right? So as you're buying it, as you're buying something, you'll say, okay, well, let's add another, $30,000 to the bottom line, because maybe we're not going to stay at this location and we're not going to pay $30 a foot, right? Let's take a look at the payroll. Let's take a look at the payroll. Let's say he was in the payroll. Who's being paid? Is it a spouse that comes in 1 or 2 days a week and is pulling in 60,000, whatever it might be. Let's figure that out. Let's look at some of the low, we always say low hanging fruit, but that's kind of where you start, and just to come up with that quality number. Now it could go the other way. Could go the other way too, where you're paying in the rent case, you're paying $15, but the market's 30. So if you're moving or doing something else and you don't have space at your current one to absorb it, well, you got to factor that in too. So there's some value there. The tax side, like Joe mentioned earlier, there's a tax implication of, if you're looking at it, if it's an LLC or an S corp and there's really no tax expense in there, well, there kind of is, because eventually it's going to flow to you. So those are the pieces to get to the quality of earnings, and then you have a solid number, right? And you have a solid number of what this is. And then you can do your valuation model from there. So, if you turn out your valuation model is 5.5 times, 6 times, at least you have somewhat of a more solid, let's call it marketable number.
Yeah, every acquisition, Mike, that that you go through. I mean, it's just quality of earnings is so critical, because I think most RIAs, independent RIAs, when they're looking to buy or sell, I mean, a lot of times the benchmark uses just revenue, right? They'll just say 1 times revenue or 2 times revenue, with 3, whatever it may be. I mean, a lot of times, valuation could be based on that, because that's just what they're billing and collecting every year, and you can use that as a good barometer for the cash coming in. But on that quality of earnings side, Rick's point, I absolutely using those KPIs through Trulytics on the front end through a quality of earnings is tremendously useful, because you could see how they compare different areas. But then I also feel like you see a lot with quality of earnings, like these, as Rick mentioned, the discretionary items, that you just, you can look at a business and they're, bringing in $5 million in fees, but what are those discretionary items running through the expense side of that business that really could be added back or subtracted or what have you to get to a true earnings number, so you know what your return on this investment is going to be. And I think, on the front end, it becomes really critical to get a good feel for that. Like, we're going through one now, and they've hired a big firm to do the quality of earnings, a national firm. But for a lot of these advisory type purchases, they're not that large. Typically, there's a lot of smaller independent RIAs that are looking to sell. But it does become an important component just to get a feel for that quality of earnings, versus revenue, to get a feel what you are actually going to bring to the bottom.
Right. And especially at this time of, 2020, 2021, where if you don't have that help, right, to get the quality of earnings, and you say, oh, I could just do this myself and figure it out. Well, you may not, something simple like PPP, right, the forgiveness piece. Maybe they netted it against payroll expense, and now you really have, let's say PPP loan was 40 grand. Now you have 40,000 bucks somewhat in that income number. That's only kind of a one-timer, right? So you can't really use that as a multiple. We got to pull that out. So those are, that's a real simple, basic one, but it's really just things like that where you really have to look at line by line, and see what's in there. It could be, you could look at, I don't know, cell phone expense, and let's say there's 3 people working there, but you're paying 6 bills. So it's, it gets a little crazy. You got to look at all that stuff.
Yeah, it's getting into the weeds. Yeah, it's definitely gets into the details, but that's what you pay a CPA to do. You're getting into the details. Yeah.
When you think about yourself as the deal maker, if you will, right? So I own this business. I'm about to go buy another business. On the one hand, you could be sitting there going, I don't want to get into all the weeds. It's like, well, yeah, that's why you hire somebody else to get into the weeds and surface the stuff that you need to look at, right? Because yes, it can be overwhelming and crazy time consuming. I think about myself and my business here. It's like, look, I don't want to have to do all the podcast editing and all the video editing. So I hire somebody to do the editing process, right? Because otherwise I can spend 10 hours editing something up and so forth. And that's taking me away from talking to another client for producing a show, or actually producing another show. Like it's just like being on the show and creating more content, right? And so the more time I'm spending in the weeds, right? But it doesn't mean it's not valuable. It still has to get done. Is you either have to decide, are you going to do it? Because to your point, what Rick was really surfacing is, wow, there's a lot of landmines in there. And the quality of earnings that you may think, oh, great, they've got 100 million AUM, looks fantastic. They're it's producing, 1.2 million of revenue every year, earnings, after owners compensation, 200 grand. That's amazing. You might find like, oh crap, there's some fluff crap in there that they're counting incorrectly that we should have known about. It could be a rude awakening.
Yeah, I think it goes back again. I think buyers and sellers often don't want to face the truth or the bad facts. They fall in love with the car.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear anything bad about it. And I think that is what you're relying on your advisors, is to really sit down and go, no, you need to hear this. You need to understand it.
Yeah.
Because we all have been there. We've all made those purchases, hopefully small ones, where gosh darn, if I only would have researched it.
Yep. That's a great point, that we all had that. And it's kind of you can all think of that one thing. For me, the refrigerator with the ice maker. I remember getting ready to buy the refrigerator, went online and looked at the reviews, and several people said loud ice maker, and it's kind of violently throws the ice out at you. I'm like, whatever. And no joke, this refrigerator still does that. And it drives me nuts. And I was like, why didn't I just listen? I could have avoided this type of thing. So,
but it looks cool. So
avoid the noisy and loud ice maker violence from my kitchen. Well, gentlemen, this has been fantastic. As always, people can follow up with you at Elevate CPA Group, correct? And you're all active on LinkedIn. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners as they're thinking about embarking upon acquiring another business or selling their business, or merging with another?
I would just say just as much as you could do up front, do what you can at that point. Similar to your thought earlier, Mike, your analogy with the home buying, depending on, if you're buying a home that's really not a lot of money and you just want to get a general inspector, which could be yourself, right? Get in there, check it out. But if you're something that has some value to it, get the specialist in there to take a look and do all that due diligence. So there's a lot less headaches in the back end.
Perfect. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been great having you on the show again.
Awesome.
I'm sure we'll have you again sometime in the future.
Yes.
Maybe we'll do it in person. Now that we're all vaccinated, we'll be able to,
Right.
have you come down here to Austin or something. We'll hang out, put a bunch of microphones around the table with beers next to each microphone, and it'll be the best recording experience of your life.
Excellent.
Sounds good.
All right, gents. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Mike. Take
Thanks.
care.
Yep.
We'll talk to you.
Thank you very much for listening to and or watching this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It's always fantastic to have you with us. I say it every week, and I really do mean it. I hope you got a lot of value out of this conversation with Brian, Joe, and Rick from Elevate CPA Group. This is a really, really important conversation because if you are listening to or watching this podcast, chances are you're going to be involved in an M&A transaction for a financial advisory business sometime in your career, probably in the not too distant future, or maybe in the not too distant past, or you're going through it right now. The stuff we talked about on this episode is really, really important. Of course, make sure you're using Trulytics to get a valuation for both the buyer and seller's business. Make sure you walk through those KPIs and understand how well suited those two businesses are to merge, right? Where the strengths and weaknesses are. But also talk to professionals like Elevate CPA Group to make sure you go through the businesses and ask questions that, frankly, wealth management professionals aren't trained to ask, right? You've been running your business and you haven't thought about evaluating another business for acquisition. Or you've been running your business and you've never thought about selling your business and the things to look for in an acquirer's business to make sure that it's going to be a good fit for your business, for your employees, for your clients. So make sure you do that. This was an awesome conversation. As always, if you haven't done so already, what are you waiting for? Click the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube. Give it a like where available, and please do leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought of the show, and then share it on social, right? Chances are, if you like this episode, somebody in your network will as well, and let them know. Share it out. Share it on LinkedIn. Share it on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you like to get your share on. Do it, okay? That's it for me. Hope you have a wonderful day. We will see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. See ya. Bye.